Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this exclusive interview we have today with Mr. Chapingua Chuma, the head of the International Labour Organization in Africa. Mr. Chuma, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us. I know you're on a very tight schedule. Mr. Chuma, field directors and officials of the International Labour Organization are meeting here in Algeria for the annual Senior Management Retreat for Africa. What are the main objectives of this meeting, and why Algeria as opposed to another African capital?
Well, I think the annual retreat is designed for us to agree on the strategic priorities for the year ahead. It's in January, February, and so we've got the whole 12 months ahead. We have to agree on what our priorities are, and also reflect on some of the things that were accomplished in the previous year and the priorities for the coming year, and just address management issues. Why Algeria? Algeria is very important to the ILO. Algeria is a member of the ILO governing body in terms of the representative of the employers, but also in terms of the government itself. But I felt that Algeria was important because they could share experiences, particularly with respect to social protection and social security systems that have been established in Algeria, but also with respect to labor inspection and with respect to some of the initiatives on employment generation. So I wanted to take advantage of our presence here to try and learn a little bit about the accomplishments of Algeria.
Yeah, about that, what are the main areas of cooperation between the ILO and Algeria currently?
Well, there are several, actually. Employment, especially for youth, that's one area. The second area, over time, has been support for social protection issues, although largely Algeria is working on this on its own now, but previously there was cooperation with the ILO. We also have work on labor inspection and labor standards, as it were. But we're also promoting tripartism and social dialogue between the government, employers, and workers' organizations. So it's not just the current areas of cooperation, but also areas where Algeria has made tremendous advances on its own, where the ILO can learn from as well.
We'll get to that a little bit later, but for now, how do you evaluate Algeria's employment promotion during the recent years?
Well, employment is a major challenge globally, and not just in Algeria. I think particularly acute in Algeria and Africa, because these are countries that have very young population. So we've got large numbers of young people that enter the labor market every year and that need productive jobs, as it were. So it's a challenge that Algeria faces, but it's also a challenge that the rest of Africa faces and the rest of the world, as it were. The employment strategy for Algeria, I think, has been quite innovative, because it does focus on skills development. It does focus on vocational and technical training. And also it does focus on linking the institutions, the educational institutions that produce workers, as it were, but also with the needs of industry. So it's not one strategy. There are several dimensions that promote the development of employment opportunities for young people and the population in general.
Yeah, very important indeed. Mr. Chuma, in terms of the signature of a national pact on economic and social growth back in February 2014, what do you comment on that? What is your comment on that?
I think that's very significant, because it demonstrates a certain level of maturity in the relationship between the government and the social partners, specifically the workers' representatives as well as the employers' representatives. But it also means that the pact is truly nationally owned. It's not just a government plan, as it were. It's a national plan, because it includes the partners as well. So this has not been easy to negotiate or develop in other countries as well. So we're looking to the success of this particular pact in Algeria to see how we can replicate and encourage other countries.
Can we replicate in regional
Well, I think we can, in terms of promoting the principles of tripartism and social dialogue around national development issues. I think that's quite important. So that's a major lesson. It's not easy, it's very difficult, but I think there is a level of, of maturity in terms of the national institutions that allowed this type of pact to be negotiated and agreed upon. And now I think the challenge is to see the implementation, and whether it will produce the desired results or not. But we have an interest in its success in that respect. Yeah.
Mr. Chuma, Algeria has been elected, as you mentioned earlier, for a three-term year as a member of the governing body of the ILO. How do you evaluate its participation so far?
Well, I think it's been constructive. It's a mature country, mature institutions. It's got excellent, tripartite relationships between, the social partners. And it's got an effective social dialogue structures, as it were. I think the pact that you mentioned earlier is evidence of that. So we're hoping that with the election of Algeria in June last year to the governing body, they'll continue to contribute to strengthen the discussions within the body, but also to be available to other countries as well and to share experiences in that sense. So I'm quite optimistic in that respect.
Mr. Chuma, your evaluation of the Algerian work contract in terms of international standards?
I have to be honest with you, I'm not very familiar with the details of the work contracts in Algeria. But what is important is that the contract, is based on genuine negotiations between the parties involved. Our interest is not in the details of the contract per se, but in ensuring that the negotiations were constructive, and they involved workers' representatives, they also involved employers' representatives, and that they are consistent with best practices in international labor standards, and this is what we promote. But ultimately, in terms of the content of the agreement itself, that's really a matter for negotiation locally. But we can facilitate that and draw attention to good practices and international labor standards. That's our role in that respect, yes.
To another matter now, the official unemployment rate in Algeria has been set at 9.8%. Your thoughts?
Any unemployment rate is high, essentially. But one has to go beyond that. And then you look at the higher levels of unemployment for young people, and perhaps even high unemployment for young women, as compared to young men as well. Generally, it compares favorably in aggregate terms, to other regions and to other countries as well. But globally, there are serious challenges to employment generation, in terms of formal employment, as it were. And in a lot of countries, you do see a fair amount of underemployment, but also a fair amount of people that survive on informal activities, as it were. Yeah.
It's very popular. In the field of social protection, right. Where does Algeria stand according to your experience?
Well, I think this is where Algeria has accomplished a lot, and it has not been overnight. It has not been easy. I think it has been over the last decades, really. Social protection in Algeria covers almost everybody, but from various walks of life, as it were, be it salaried workers, informal workers, be it also women on maternity and all. It's very comprehensive and it's very impressive. And in fact, one of the discussions we had with the directors from the African offices is with the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare, to look in particular at the experience of Algeria with respect to social protection and social welfare and social security, as it were. So as far as I can tell, I think it's one of the best structured, and continuously improving, as it were, because it's been in progress really over several decades, as it were.
Mm-hmm. About social security now, social security. Algeria has been somewhat criticized by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund because it kept its social security policy unchanged in the light of the current financial crisis and the economic crisis, the international economic crisis. What are your comments on that? Should it change its policy a little bit?
Well, I think that's a decision for the Algerians to make. in fact, and decide and look into the circumstances, look into its financial position and the financial implications and make a decision. I do not think that it is the responsibility of the ILO or the World Bank or the institutions to tell Algerians what to do or not to do. I think it's a mature country with a very well-educated population. And,
but from your experience, sir, what can you advise?
I tend to disagree if the World Bank recommended that. I mean, I think Algeria is capable of carrying out analysis, you know, of their circumstances and their requirements and their capacity to support a social security system, and then decide whether or not to implement it. I think our role is to, you know, frankly, as international organizations, is to give options and choices and point to impact, point to good practices from other countries, and then allow the Algerians to make the decision they find appropriate. And then once that's done, I think our role is to support that, you know, going forward.
Mr. Chuma, Algeria is in the process, as you may know, of creating a new labor code, amending the labor code. Any advice? Again, we have to make use of your experience.
Well, you know, I'm not familiar with the details of the labor code, but I was told by the minister that there is work to amend and update it and modernize it, as it were. As I said, we, as ILO, do not dictate the precise details of what the labor code should or should not be in the Algerian circumstances.
So it differs in each country, each experience? It
differs in different countries, but our role really is to provide technical support, if the government requires it, on how a modern labor code for a modern state can be structured.
Do you think it needs it?
I think all codes, all laws periodically need to be reviewed to make sure that they remain relevant and to make sure that they take into account the current conditions over time. I think that's really a good practice, as it were. But I think what will be important is that as ILO, we have tremendous amount of experience and knowledge and expertise around labor laws. And we also have international labor standards that over time we've defined and negotiated. And all this, you know, bank of information and knowledge and expertise will be made available to Algeria as they go through the process of negotiating a new labor code. Yeah, and that's our legitimate role as a partner.
Mr. Chuma, to another topic that may interest a lot of people, is the investment policy of Algeria, foreign investment policy, the 51-49%. Some people say it hinders foreign investment, which automatically hinders the creation of more jobs for young people. Algeria is a very young country. Right. I mean, the population, the age level. So what do you say about that? Do you think it really hinders it?
Well, it's difficult to say, you know, superficially whether it hinders or doesn't hinder. I assume when that policy was made, there was enough analysis, enough research, enough, you know, assessment of the experiences from elsewhere. But I think what's important, you know, in terms of investment, it's really the predictability of policy, you know, the clarity of policy. You know, investors can always price, you know, the premium on their participation if they know clearly that the Algerian government has got a structure of 51-49%, and that structure is backed by law and it's consistent. They'll find a way of working with that, you know. So whether it increases or doesn't increases, you know, it's neither here nor there. But I think what's important, frankly, for an international investor is predictability of policy and consistency of policy, and to be assured that if they come here, the policy is not going to change for the next 20 years. You know, they can invest and make their money return and all that. Consistency, I think that's critical really for investment decisions, much more than the detail of 30, 25%, that type of thing, yeah.
Definitely. Mr. Chuma, to another topic, migrant workers. I know the ILO gives special importance to that. How do you evaluate the situation of migrant workers in Algeria?
I'm not familiar with the details. We tend to work at the continental level with the African Union to try and develop common platforms, common frameworks, you know, But we also work at the sub-regional level, say the Maghreb or ECOWAS for West Africa. And in some cases, we work with specific countries around migration issues. But it's a very important issue in terms of trying to encourage the movement of professional people, from one country to another, and to make sure that the rights of migrants are protected, but also the concerns of countries that host migrants are taken into account, especially in this day and age where everybody is concerned about security, as it were. So we are working on the broader issues around migration and making sure that migration can be looked at as a positive movement of people. Because if you look at the world, it has developed precisely because people were able to move, from one area to another and make a contribution. And so if properly structured, I think migrants can contribute to development.
Especially now that Algeria is relatively a very secure country compared to the regional situation. So chances are we are going to have more migrant workers come into Algeria. You mentioned women earlier, Mr. Chuma.
Yes.
So I would have to ask you, how do you evaluate the situation of labor for women in Algeria or in the Maghreb or the African context?
Well, generally, I think a lot more could be done to promote the engagement of women in development, in productive employment, and while in those jobs, to ensure that they are paid fair wages for fair amount of work, equal wages for equal work. These are points of principle for us. We promoted that.
Is this principle respected in Africa as a whole today?
Well, it depends. In some countries they do. In other countries, not as much as we would like to see. So it's a work in progress. I mean, we continue to encourage this, to point to areas of improvement. And I attended the African Union summit last week, and they adopted 2015 as the year for women economic empowerment and all. That's an area that we're going to work with the African Union. But at the country level, we encourage that as much as possible. But
what can we do concretely, except for encouragement and
Well, concretely, you have to have enabling legislation.
Yes.
The laws must recognize the equality, particularly in the world of work. That's one. And then thereafter, of course, you can have the most elegant laws. They have to be implemented. And there have to be institutions that promote that. And because in a lot of countries over time, women have suffered discrimination and all, you need to come up with specific programs, that can address some of this situation. And my impressions of Algeria, having been here, is that I think you see a lot of women professionals in all walks. You're a good example in that respect. And last night, in the last 2 days, I've had a chance to have conversation, I think, with about 7 women ministers.
Yes, I was going to point out to that.
And all that. And there's they're not there because they're women. They're professionals in their own right. They're well educated. They happen to be women. And I think they also set a very good example to other young women that aspire to non-traditional professions and going forward. Yeah.
Mr. Chuma, you mentioned the African Union. In terms of the 2015's objectives that the African Union has set, what are the ILO's regional priorities in Africa this year?
I think we have 4 main priorities. One is to continue to work on employment issues at the regional level, but also with African governments, particularly focusing on the employment of young people. And in this respect, we're looking at the totality of the employment question. We're looking at enterprise development. We're looking at skills development as well, and promoting rural employment, as it were. So it's more the comprehensive approach to employment. The second is the question of social protection, recognizing that over time, even though most African economies have grown significantly in the last 10 years, but we do see increases in inequality. And so we need to respond to inequality through social protection measures and social welfare and social security, the type of areas where I think Algeria has done very well. The third priority is what you mentioned earlier, the question of migration, increasingly. But we also work in another area which does not apply to Algeria per se. These are fragile states, because if you look globally, the countries there are 19 countries that are regarded as fragile. 13 of those are in Africa. And you will understand, especially where you are as Algeria, near Tunisia, near also Libya, and all those other countries.
Mali also.
Yes, Mali as well. And so these are areas that the ILO needs to develop specific programs of intervention. But this last priority doesn't quite apply to Algeria, and thank God in that respect, because it is a stable country over time. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chuma. Would you say the meeting in Algeria was a success so far?
I think so. It's been excellent. These are directors from the whole of Africa. We also had a very large team from Geneva that came here, and we had very good discussions, but we also had a chance to share experiences with Algeria, particularly around social protection issues. Yes, the discussions are still going on, and I think everybody also has been extremely happy to just be here. I was here last October to visit. That's when I decided.
That was your first official
my first
visit.
Yes. And that's when I decided that I think I'm going to have my annual retreat here. And
you're most
I
welcome.
think I didn't make a mistake in that sense. I was very happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you.
Thank you very much.
My last question, you're going to meet with Prime Minister Abdelmalek Sillal. Can you brief us a little bit about the main topics you're going to be addressing with him?
Well, yes. It's not really a substantive meeting per se. It's a courtesy call, really, to pay our respects to the leadership of this country. For me, is also to express my profound appreciation, really, for the support that our meeting is received from the government and the people as well, and to look forward to continued collaboration with ILO. I think ILO in this country, because we're trying to rebuild and strengthen the office so that it supports the entire Maghreb from Algiers. We've got a very good leader in Mohamed Ali Ould Sidi, and he's received tremendous support from the government.
Director of the Algerian Bureau.
Yes, the Algeria office. So it's really to pay our respects and thank the Honorable Prime Minister on behalf of the ILO in that respect.
Well, we're certainly very happy to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me today.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward to having you again in Algeria.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And
thank
good
you.
luck in your work. And
thank you
very much indeed for having me.
Thank you.
Okay.
With this, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our exclusive interview with Mr. Chapingua Chuma, the head of the International Labour Organization in the African region. Thank you for watching.